But here we're going to talk about the Hall of Fame, which will be this weekend. A great friend of mine, J.A. Adande, will be going in, getting the Kirk Gowdy Award. So I'll be going there to see him, just to support. He's been a great friend of me throughout the years. So it's always good. Mark Spears, last year went to see him. That was my first time at the Hall of Fame. And there is a star-studded class going this year to some degree. I'm going to read off some of the names for you. Vince Carter is going in, Michael Cooper, Chauncey Billups, and Walter Davis, the late Walter Davis. Now, it's a couple of names here that piqued me just a little bit. Now, if you only remember Vince Carter as half man, half amazing throughout the start of his career and then the end of his career where he was the traveling vet, right? There is a big piece in there that is missing. And I think just from the standpoint of not necessarily longevity, but there was a decade of excellence there, even throughout some of the things that were a little bit on the confusing side, or you didn't feel like he, fulfilled all of his potential. I think you guys need to know this, right? Basketball Reference has his probability at 94.5%. Not that you go by exactly what that says, because it can be a very flawed statistic, but that number is higher than Kawhi Leonard, Tony Parker, and James Worthy. Now, we know Kawhi Leonard is getting in regardless of how short that highlight film is, right? That highlight film is not going to be long for Kawhi Leonard when he gets in. He's not going to play a whole lot of games, I don't think, for the rest of his career. I'd be surprised if he played more than 50 in any season for the rest of his career, given how his body worked. But he's got 2 finals MVPs. That's going to put him in there. Tony Parker, from an international standpoint, he's going to get in there. James Worthy, as a finals MVP in the collegiate career that he had in North Carolina, got in and nobody really quibbled on it. And he was a top 50 player. Nobody really quibbled on it. But if you did a deeper dive, you'd probably have some questions. I don't have a lot of questions about Vince Carter because from a 10-year span, that's from 99 when he came in as a rookie during that lockout shortened season to 2009, he was an 8-time All-Star. He averaged 24, 5, and 4 and was really, really efficient. Like in the beginning, when Vince Carter stopped dunking a lot, people were saying, Vince Carter, you're settling for too many threes. Now, if Vince Carter entered the league, people would be saying, Vince Carter, you need to take more threes. How this work? You see how this works, y'all? Like the tone and tenor of this changes. Like we talk about Kobe Bryant being like this descendant of Michael Jordan. And whenever you see the highlight videos spliced and everything else, it's like, oh, that move looks just like Michael. You know what you're always watching? You're watching old Mike and young Kobe. You're not watching Furious Styles Michael Jordan. You're not watching the Michael Jordan that put the ball fake out there and made you fall, dunked on you, and then had Charles Oakley pointing at you. Like, remember that highlight against the Hawks? That way back when? That was the type of game that Vince Carter was playing. Like the way that he moved with the fury, with the violence. Like Kobe never had that violence. Vince Carter had the violence of Michael Jordan. That's what you're seeing when you see Anthony Edwards play. You don't necessarily see the polish of a late career Michael Jordan or the polish of Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant played with polish very early in his career and maintained it throughout. Vince Carter played with fury early on in his career. That's very similar to Michael Jordan, very similar to Anthony Edwards. And I think that's the thing that we're going to go and remember this weekend when we go and see the Vince Carter film. We're going to see more than the dunk contest. Everybody remembers where they were during that 2000 dunk contest in Oakland. Everybody remembers where they were. If you saw it, wherever you were, you remembered it because every dunk was like, oh my God, he just did that. How's he top it? Then he did something else. Then he went between the legs, right? Y'all remember all that? Like even his worst dunk was him standing behind the rim, taking one dribble and doing a full one-arm windmill. And everybody's like, that was still a 50 though, right? Like it's just amazing. And I think getting into the Hall of Fame gives everybody a chance to fully appreciate the legend that is Vince Carter. and be able to appreciate what he was as opposed to what he wasn't when people wanted so much more from him. Speaking of someone wanting much more from him, that's where I go with Chauncey Billups, but in the inverse. Because in the beginning of Chauncey Billups' career, remember, he was traded midway through his rookie season. He was traded from Boston to Toronto because Rick Pitino thought he was getting Tim Duncan. And he wound up with Chauncey Billups and Ron Mercer. And usually guys who get traded midway through their rookie year, that's usually a bad omen. No matter what era of the NBA you're in, unless there's like a Kevin Johnson, Mark Price situation where, someone emerges and somebody got to go. Okay, fine. That sort of thing happens. But Chauncey Billups had such a rough start to his career. You were not sure that he was going to make it to fulfill any level of top 5 promise, let alone going to Detroit in 2002 after a really good year in Minnesota with Kevin Garnett and under the late Flip Saunders. Like, he started to blossom a little bit. Terrell Brandon was hurt. Chauncey Billups got an opening. But think about that. Chauncey Billups was drafted in 1997, and he didn't start finding his footing till like 2001, 2002. Like, that takes a long time. Like, he's one of those great anomalies in terms of Hall of Fame, not in terms of his pedigree, because he was the Colorado Player of the Year. He had, a top 3, top 5 pick. He didn't come out of nowhere, but usually you give up on guys. And a lot of teams did give up on Chauncey Billups. So when he got to Detroit in 2002, he and Rip Hamilton got there at the same time. They went from being a good team to a really, really good team. And then the next year they won a championship. And Chauncey Billups cemented himself not only as a point guard, because he had trouble manning the position in the beginning. That was the problem that people had with Chauncey, was saying he's got point guard size, but does he have point guard mentality? And then he became sort of the quintessential point guard, the guy that can set the table and then also shoot threes. And at a time where the game wasn't allowing for high volume 3-point shooters from the point guard position. So Chauncey getting a 5-time All-Star bid and averaging 17, 6, and 3 on his height, shooting 40% from 3 and 90% from the line meant that he was really, really reliable. And then that 5-game series against the Lakers in 2004, where you're looking up and you're saying, hey, Chauncey Billups could be the finals MVP. It could be Rip Hamilton. It could be any one of those guys. But Chauncey was the catalyst. Like, we talked about this a little bit with Isis, saying the point guard being the head of the snake, the catalyst. And you got to see it there, especially for that Piston team that went to 6 straight Eastern Conference finals from 2003 to 2008. They had some great battles with the Dwayne Wades, with the LeBron James, and then later with Kevin Garnett and those Celtics. And then Chauncey went on after being traded for Allen Iverson, taking the Denver Nuggets, going back home to the Denver Nuggets team that he had actually once played for, taking those Denver Nuggets to the Western Conference Finals in 2009 and getting efficient basketball out of Carmelo Anthony. Now, his basketball reference probability is actually a lot higher than people would think, because you're looking at him, you're thinking Chauncey Billups didn't put up the gaudy stats, but his Hall of Fame probability was 84.4%. That's higher than Tim Hardaway, who just got in, higher than Joe Dumars, who got in reasonably early. Pretty much, that's probably the best comparison in terms of play style and finals MVPs. I think they were both 5-time All-Stars. Maybe Dumars was 6, if I remember correctly. And Rodney, I'm going to do quick math in my head. Dumars was All-Star in 90, 91, 92, 93, 95, and 97. So that's 6 times. So Joe made the All-Star team one more year. I just did that off the top of the dome. Y'all should appreciate me for that. And Dennis Rodman, who's a one-sided player, but had offensive skill, just didn't display it offensively. And Rodman, of course, was one of the premier defensive players of all time, and quite arguably the greatest rebounder that we've seen post-Chamberlain, post-Russell in a semi-modern NBA. That brings us to the questionable part of this Hall of Fame that we got to be honest about. Is Michael Cooper a Hall of Famer? Because my thing on the Hall of Fame, and I got it from one of my mentors, Rob Parker, who's very, very big as a Hall of Fame voter for Major League Baseball. And Rob's thing is, if I have to think about it, the answer is no. If you're not a Hall of Famer the day you retire, then you're not a Hall of Famer. Now, the NBA is a little bit different because you bring so much more into the discussion. You bring more than just your playing days. You bring in what you do in college. You bring in if you're a coach. You bring in if you're a coach at the women's game, which Michael Cooper has done, right? He's a two-time WNBA champion as a coach and a coach of the year in the W. I'm sure that helped. He got his jersey retired by the Lakers, a very discerning franchise when it comes to retiring jerseys. Even though Kobe Bryant has 2 up there, he probably earned those 2 jerseys, but that's more symbolic than anything else. But Coop, I think, averaged double figures 1 time in his career. He wasn't a starter with the Showtime Lakers. He was a 5-time NBA champion. He was on all of those Magic Johnson Showtime championship teams. He was an 8-time member of the All-Defensive Team. His Hall of Fame probability was 0.9%. Once again, it's an imperfect science. But I wonder if a guy like Ben Wallace, when he got in, that opened the door for him. Now, Ben Wallace was a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year. He was a starter. He was an all-star. He was an anchor on the interior for one of the best defenses that we've seen over the past 25 years. No matter what you think, that's the role that Ben Wallace played. Michael Cooper was a great role player for the Showtime Lakers. He was there when Norm Nixon was there. Norm Nixon was replaced by Byron Scott. He was there when Bob McAdoo was there, and James Worthy, and Jamal Wilkes, and of course, Magic and Kareem as the linchpins. And now you look at that Laker team and you're saying, man, one of the greatest dynasties of all time. And maybe that's some residuals. Maybe that's residuals for playing for the Showtime Lakers at that time when the Lakers meant so much to the NBA. And well, don't forget, he was the 1987 Defensive Player of the Year. And, you know, there's always going to be some great highlights that they're going to play over the weekend. I think there was a time that Larry Bird bumped skinny ass Cooper out of bounds because Coop was all time skinny. You know what I mean? Like he was 3-and-D before we had the term 3-and-D. And I do think that counts for something. And I do think in a way, if we are rewarding guys for being unabashed chuckers on the offensive end, if you average 20 points a game, and you have some level of personal success, impacting team success, even if you don't play on the other end of the floor, you're probably going to get a couple All-Star appearances. You're probably going to get in merit Hall of Fame discussions. So why would I then punish a player for playing the other end of the floor primarily? It just gives me a little bit of pause. Because I didn't think when Michael Cooper retired, I believe, after the 90 season. So him and Pat Riley left out the door at the same time. Kareem left the year before. He wasn't a part of the 91 team that Magic basically dragged to the NBA Finals and basically were lambs to slaughter by the Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls. Maybe arguably the best Bulls team that we've seen was the first one, where Michael was completely maniacal. And Coop, for all of that he could have did, wasn't going to do nothing against that dude. He got out just in time. But I'm not sure. It just makes me feel a little bit of a way. You know, if Michael Cooper gets in, I got questions about Bill Laimbeer. Can Bill Laimbeer get in? I know Lamb is not the most beloved of characters, but Lamb was an all-star. Lamb was a 4-time all-star, I believe, a rebounding champion. There are some players that you think about that you're like, okay, once one guy gets in, it has to open the door. And if we're going to include WNBA success here, Bill Laimbeer being this championship coach for the Detroit Shock, I think he won 3 WNBA championships as the head coach and GM of that franchise. That means something. I just wonder. But congrats to Coop and the rest of the class. And there's another guy that I do want to mention because I feel like players of a certain time get lost to time, lost to eras. And there was a period of time in the NBA where the drugs were a part of the discussion. You couldn't have certain discussions without talking about players having bad habits. And Walter Davis was one of those guys. But even despite that, that shouldn't even be the first line that I mentioned about Walter Davis. I don't want to besmirch this man's memory. He died actually last year at the age of 69. But he was one of those guys you had to see. He's one of those guys that you legit had to see that somebody from a previous generation said, hey, he was that dude. You know what I mean? He was that dude. And believe it or not, he was a 6-time All-Star. And he averaged 21, 4, and 3 from 1978 to 1987, right at the heart of his prime. His Hall of Fame probability is 30.9%, which you're thinking, that doesn't mean that's not a whole lot, but it's right behind Reggie Miller. And we all seem to agree without much dissection that Reggie Miller is a Hall of Fame. Stamped. Hall of Fame because of what he did against the Knicks, because of how he carried that franchise in Indianapolis. And I completely agree. When you carry a franchise, and not like, oh, if you stay, that means you're better, but carrying a franchise, I think, means something in a completely different way, especially if you're able to carry them to some level of relevance and some level of contention. But the numbers say that those two are comparable players. And yet and still, it took Walter Davis all these years to get in, and he won't be able to actually give his speech. He won't be able to actually enjoy his flowers. And I would not be the person to take the flowers from him. He's actually the Suns' all-time leading scorer with over 15,000 points, right under 16,000 points. His number 6 is retired by the franchise, and that is a very rich franchise of players. Maybe not necessarily in terms of longevity, because Barkley only played there, I believe, 4 years. Kevin Johnson played there. Steve Nash won both of his MVPs there. Jason Kidd had had the stints there that he had, but it wasn't as linear. You know, they've had a lot of great players run through there. The Shawn Marions, the Amari Stoudemires, like they've had great players. Grant Hill played there on the back end of his career. But for Walter Davis to be the number one guy in terms of scoring, that says a lot. And I think guys of a certain era, Michael Ray Richardson, who some people said, man, he was the scariest dude I ever went against. During the time that Magic Johnson was roaming the earth, and people were saying they were more scared of Michael Ray Richardson than they were of Magic Johnson during a certain era, just because of the diverse talents and the way that guys came into the league and they played with a certain level of swag and athleticism. Absolutely. So I just wanted to make note of those guys going in different levels of Hall of Fame per se. Like, not everybody has to be a slam dunk Michael Jordan Hall of Famer, but I do think that some guys warrant more discussion and where we go from there. But congrats to Michael Cooper. He got his jersey retired. I'm not sure if it was around Christmas. It was sometime during the regular season, because I happened to be in the building when Coop got his jersey retired, and to see all the Showtime Lakers there is always a great thing, especially as the Kareems and those guys get older. You got to pay homage to those ball players, because they're becoming trading cards as they get older. Like, they're not guaranteed to be around forever, you know, as we've seen when we lost Bill Russell a couple of years ago, and you don't hear that infectious laugh anymore. And you saw that to Dikembe Mutombo, you know, although different situation, he passed a couple of weeks ago, right on the morning of Media Day. So it's going to be a great commemoration of the Hall of Fame this weekend in Hartford, Connecticut, and also in Springfield, Massachusetts.